Welcome back. Let's continue with part 2 of the chapter on Silent Hill. Now for my next point, I'd first like to bring up Resident Evil once more and the fact that it kind of disguises itself as an American zombie film. And I'm bringing this up because, similar to this, as you have seen, Silent Hill also makes use of a US-American setting, but underneath all that, Silent Hill is a lot more Japanese than it lets on, because it actually contains various elements that can be traced back to Japanese society, pop culture, etc. And in the following part, I would like to show and explain some of these. Let us start with Alessa. Back in video 3.7, when we talked about the emergence of J-horror around 1996-1998 and the evolution of female ghosts in Japanese horror in general, I mentioned some new trends, and one of these was that there was a lot more focus on children, with the supernatural entity sometimes being a female child and/or their backstory focusing a lot on their childhood, quite often portraying a girl with some kind of supernatural powers, which was also sometimes accompanied by depictions of some sort of conflict between the child and its parent or parents. In this regard, Alessa's past as a little girl with supernatural powers who could kill people with her mind and who had an abusive parent in her mother Dahlia Gillespie certainly fits this pattern. Next, let us talk about the first time the game changes from the fog world to darkness for a longer period of time and gives you a proper place to explore, because this happens right before you enter an elementary school. As we have seen in previous videos, schools at night are one of the most typical setting for contemporary horror stories in Japan. Remember, there's even a term for it called Gakkou no Kaidan, which, as explained before, refers to all sorts of scary stories related to school settings. It's actually also a popular dare among Japanese students to challenge each other to enter their school at night because of this association of schools with paranormal activities. In general, the whole idea of haunted schools or scary encounters at school can be found all over the place in Japanese cinema, literature, games, and so on. So, with schools at night counting as one of the typical places for hauntings and other creepy happenings in Japan, it's probably not a coincidence that the first major place you get to explore in Silent Hill 1 turns out to be a school, and that the game switches from day to night just before you enter it. What's more, a lot of Japanese school horror stories center on very particular places within the school. Quite often it's places like the chemistry lab, the music room, the gym, the library, or the restroom. And Silent Hill also follows this pattern because two of the major riddles you have to solve at the school in Silent Hill 1 take place in the school's chemistry lab and the school's music room. Furthermore, the library is another important place that you have to visit in order to proceed. And as for the restrooms, there's a tremendously famous Toshi Densetsu, or Japanese urban legend, related to school restrooms. It's called Toire no Hanako-san, which translates to Hanako from the toilet. As is often the case with such urban legends, there are many variations, but it basically deals with the ghost of a girl called Hanako who is haunting school restrooms. Apart from that, there also are many kaidan or urban legends that deal with restrooms in other places, such as public restrooms in parks, train stations, and so on. And the first 3 Silent Hill games all contain scary events related to restrooms that might have been inspired by these popular and well-known trends from Japanese horror fiction. In Silent Hill 1, you can enter one of the restrooms of the elementary school and will suddenly hear crying from inside one of the toilet stalls. You cannot open this stall, you never see who exactly was crying, you never get any explicit explanation for it, which is another good example, by the way, of the aforementioned uncertainty and non-visual horror that can be found in Silent Hill. Now, personally, I'm fairly certain that the scene is meant to hint at Alessa, who was bullied at school, but I also think it's likely that the tremendously famous urban legend of Toire no Hanako-san inspired the developers to place such a scene not just anywhere, but inside the restroom of an elementary school at night. In Silent Hill 2, you can find a restroom in an old prison with a stall that has been locked from the inside. If you knock on the door, there will be no reaction, but once you decide to leave the room, however, there will sometimes occur a sudden loud noise and what sounds like an angry scream. Once again, you get no explanation though and are unable to see what's inside. Finally, in Silent Hill 3, you can find a locked toilet stall in a restroom while traversing the other world. That's already eerie because in the nightmarish other world, you rarely meet anything other than monsters, which immediately begs the question, what exactly is on the other side of that stall door? But it gets even worse, for if you knock on this door, something from inside will knock back. Nothing else, no vocal reply or anything, it will just quietly knock back. And it still doesn't end there. If you try to leave, this happens. First of all, this is yet another interesting example of the psychological non-visual horror that Silent Hill employs, since the agent of the knocking and door opening is ultimately left bodiless. In a game with more explicit horror, this would have been a great moment for a jump scare with a monster leaping out of there attacking the player, but to have no reveal at all, no explanation, just an empty stall that leaves the player with an unsettling feeling lingering in the air. And to return to the original point, it is quite possible that this repeated use of restrooms of all places to scare and unnerve the player throughout various Silent Hill titles was inspired by the famous Japanese urban legend about a haunted school restroom, Toilet no Hanako-san, and the many other scary stories related to restrooms that can be found in Japan. Now, after the school, the player eventually ends up exploring a hospital. Of course, hospitals are used in scary stories all over the world, since they are related not only to life and healing, but also to death and suffering, making them a very suitable setting for horror. So, exploring a hospital in and of itself is not yet a sign of Silent Hill's Japanese roots, but in the hospital in Silent Hill 1, the player eventually enters an elevator with buttons for the basement, the first floor, the second floor, and the third floor. When the player has visited all these floors without finding anything useful and returns to the elevator once more, there suddenly is another button, A4. This is already pretty uncanny no matter where you're from, because the map for the hospital clearly shows that it shouldn't have a fourth floor. But for Japanese players, this can be scary on yet another level, the reason being as follows. This has been mentioned in a previous video as well, but one of the ways to read the Japanese character for the number 4 is shi. However, shi is also how you read the Japanese character for death. Because of that, the number 4 is considered an unlucky number in Japan and is sometimes avoided. Some hospitals, hotels, or apartment buildings in Japan do not have rooms with the number 4. So next to room number 103, for example, you might find room 105 instead of room 104. And there are rare cases where certain buildings, especially hospitals, even leave out the 4th floor altogether and just go from 3rd floor to 5th floor in their numbering. If you take into consideration this superstitious fear of the number 4 that can be found in various places and situations throughout Japan, I would argue that it's quite likely that the Japanese developers of Silent Hill 1 also considered the meaning of the number 4 in their culture when they created this scene where a hospital suddenly has a 4th floor that wasn't there before. Finally, my last point with regards to Silent Hill's Japanese roots is related to an article called The Empty Return: Circularity and Repetition in Recent Japanese Horror Films, written by Aaron Garoff and published in the Austrian journal Minikomi number 64 in 2002. According to Garoff, many Japanese horror films around the end of the 1990s dealt with circularity and repetition. As an example, think of the cursed videotape in Ringu that has to be copied in order to survive its curse, thus leading to a possibly endless duplication of the video and a constant repetition of the curse. And to a certain extent, such elements can also be found within Silent Hill. I have already talked about the connection between Alessa and her duplicate Cheryl when I summarized the first game's plot, but it doesn't end there. In the good ending of Silent Hill 1, which is considered canon, Alessa eventually dies, but shortly before she passes away, she uses her powers to create a baby and gives it to Harry. This ending is picked up again by Silent Hill 3, where you play a 17-year-old teenager called Heather, who turns out to be that very baby that was created by Alessa and given to Harry. So if we put all that together, 7-year-old Alessa almost dies in a ritual and creates a copy of herself, namely Cheryl, who is brought outside town. 7 years later, Cheryl, lured in by Dahlia's spell, comes back to reunite with Alessa, only for the restored Alessa to then die completely but create yet yet another copy of herself that is brought away by Harry again and gets named Heather, only for Heather to then come back to Silent Hill, where she eventually remembers her past self Alessa and even has to fight against a copy of herself that looks like Alessa. Or take the frequent shifts from Fog World to Otherworld, back to Fog World, and so on. Silent Hill constantly cycles back and forth between these versions, with the Otherworld often depicting a twisted and distorted repetition of places you have already visited. On top of that, the Fog World itself is already a warped copy of the original town. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that the developers deliberately sat down and said, hey, horror films currently make use of circularity and repetition, so let's put that into our games as well, but at the very least it's not impossible that the tendency to use such elements in horror films around the time of Silent Hill's creation might have directly or perhaps just subconsciously influenced some of the writing in these games. And even if it's just a coincidence, it still is interesting to notice these aspects of circularity and repetition within Silent Hill. Alright, before we reach the end of this video, let's also take one quick look at a few of the influences from outside Japan that inspired the developers of Silent Hill. Because while there are a lot of Japanese influences that can be discovered both in the first game as well as in later entries, there definitely also are influences from outside Japan that contributed to these games. American filmmaker David Lynch, who is known for his mysterious and atmospheric works, was already mentioned earlier as one of the possible sources of inspiration for Silent Hill 1's director and scenario writer Toyama Keiichiro. There's also at least one nod to David Lynch's film Blue Velvet in Silent Hill 2, by the way. Then there is the American horror film Jacob's Ladder from 1990, directed by Adrian Lyne. Some of the bizarre visual elements of Silent Hill's nightmarish Otherworld have been directly inspired by this movie. There's a scene in Jacob's Ladder where the protagonist ends up on a stretcher with two male nurses pushing him. He's supposed to be brought to a normal doctor, but while he is being pushed, the scenery around him changes and becomes increasingly grotesque and terrifying. Take a look. Of particular note here is how the ceiling above him turns into the very kind of metal grates that can be found everywhere in Silent Hill's Otherworld. On top of that, this scene is one of the cases where Jacob's Ladder made use of an effect where people's heads were jerking in various directions with inhuman speed. The same effect is used for some monster movements in Silent Hill 2 and is also used several times in Silent Hill 3. There's also a scene in which the protagonist of Jacob's Ladder exits a subway train at a station called Bergen Street and eventually ends up walking on the rail tracks where he almost gets run over by another subway train. Silent Hill 3 contains a direct reference to this because at one point, protagonist Heather enters a subway station with the intention of reaching a station that is called Bergen Street, and she also ends up on the rail tracks for a brief moment where she almost gets run over by a subway train. The whole locations even look extremely alike and have some other similarities. Finally, there's a scene with a nurse in Jacob's Ladder who has a weird lump growing on her head. This might have served as inspiration for the hostile nurses you encounter in Silent Hill 1 who have a strange lump growing from their back. In terms of possible inspirations from the world of literature, the fact that Silent Hill is shrouded in mysterious fog was quite likely a nod to US-American horror author Stephen King's work The Mist from 1980, which also deals with the town suddenly being engulfed in strange fog and even features an attack by pterosaur-like creatures coming inside through a broken window, kind of like the monster that attacks the player at the start of Silent Hill 1. Alright, there are certainly further non-Japanese influences that can be found within the series, but those were the most prominent examples I wanted to mention, and although I could probably talk about Silent Hill all day, I feel like this is a good point to end the video. So, in conclusion, Silent Hill 1 took certain gameplay mechanics from Resident Evil and also made use of a similar westernized setting, but then went into a very different direction with it. Resident Evil had portrayed a zombie scenario similar to US zombie films with predominantly visual and explicit horror as well as a scientific explanation at the core of its horror. Silent Hill, on the other hand, with its supernatural plot, psychological horror, and heavy focus on atmosphere, feels a lot closer to the kind of horror that could be found within Tsuruta Norio's V-Cinema series Honto ni Atta Kowai Hanashi from 1991, and within the genre of J-horror that is said to have been kicked off by Honto ni Atta Kowai Hanashi and to have gained traction around the time of Silent Hill 1's development. Furthermore, despite its westernized presentation, there are various elements within Silent Hill that point towards its Japanese roots, such as featuring a female character with supernatural powers at the core of the story, making the player visit locations that are typical for Japanese ghost stories and urban legends, making a fourth floor appear in a 3-story hospital, or including what might be references to the popular Japanese urban legend of Toiru no Hanako-san. At the same time, Western influences can certainly be found as well, such as the works of David Lynch and Stephen King, or the movie Jacob's Ladder, directed by Adrian Lyne. After Silent Hill 4, however, the series was not produced in Japan anymore until recently, when Konami, after a long hiatus of the Silent Hill franchise, announced in 2022 that they were working on new entries again. Well, whatever the future holds for the franchise, one thing is certain. Back then, when Silent Hill 1 was released, it was an atmospheric masterpiece of psychological horror and a great example of a Japanese horror game that's filled with uncanny elements. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. In the next one, we will talk about a Japanese horror game that went down a different path as it took place in a truly Japanese setting and fully embraced all the typical motifs of J-horror and classical Japanese ghost stories, namely Zero. I hope to see you then. And as always, take care and goodbye.